because we have movable syntax in German. Verse may even artificially inflate how many of these people use, just because of the fact that in poetry, you are playing with language more, you're showing off your language more, right? So you're going to use more images, more image-rich language. So, if you have any questions, we've got, I think about 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were, in some of the dialects you were saying, like, pronouncing the W differently. When did that change occur?
I pronounce all of the W's, I hope, unless I mess up, as W's. In the Middle High German period, the W's were pronounced like W's. It changed to the V pronunciation only after the Middle High German period, over quite a long time, but basically up through the Reformation era, some dialects could still have W sounds. I don't remember which slide it was, so I won't go back and try to find it. But did you notice that in Old High German, there wasn't a W on some of the Werden? What did they have? Two U's, right? You know, a W is two U's, right? So that shows you, particularly in the Old High German period, that it really was a W sound, for example, and not the V sound, which happened later. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And when did the phrase like pregnant with joy or using that come around?
I don't know about for English. Probably not until the modern English period. I don't think that exists in Middle English at all. But in German, that's not how you'd say it anyway. In other words, what again is the standard German word for pregnant? Schwanger. But that's not used as frequently to say pregnant with emotion or something like that, right? So it's not even the same case for German. But for English, that's definitely a modern English development. Yeah. Yes.
So, like the skaldic poetry from like Scandinavia, is that at all related to the High German we're talking about? I guess it's roughly the same period.
Okay. That's a loaded question. It is linguistically related. It's a Germanic language, right? So a lot of the words are going to look similar. But skaldic poetry is the type of poetry that really makes it hard to look for units like this. Middle High German poetry has end rhyme, right? It's got end rhyme and it's got some different metrical forms, but in general, it's pretty loose, right? In terms of restrictions, compared to something like skaldic. Because skaldic has rhyme, it has internal rhyme, where some things rhyme within the lines, it has syllable counting, it has a syntax that is so tortured, you will often have one word in line 1 whose, say, genitive complement is in line 4, in words that, next to words that have nothing to do with it, right? So it's such a convoluted poetic art form that it's really tough to find phraseological units in skaldic poetry. What you do have, since are you a fan? Do you read skaldic poetry?
Or with the poetic and prose data.
Excellent. Yeah. So what you find, what's the type of multi-word unit that you find in skaldic poetry?
Well, I didn't read it in German, so.
Oh, I mean, if you read it in English, that's okay. Do you know what a kenning is? Okay. Anyway, it's a poetic form, but that's what they use instead, because that's what fits the system. Yeah. In other words, it's so artificial that you can't find very much natural language. Yeah.
How did the body of work change
High German period. What's the colloquial name for the early Middle Ages? The Dark Ages, right? Which, if you've ever had a history class, I'm sure your teacher has said, you know, why you shouldn't use that term, right? But in the so-called Dark Ages, we have a very, very low number of literate people, right? Who did I mention wrote the texts? Books, right? So it's people in the ecclesiastical system who had access to literacy, okay? And they were writing texts for their communities, gospel texts to be read in the monastery. They were compiling glossaries so that people who weren't very good at Latin could get better at Latin by looking at their native word, right? And also for people who would preach to lay audiences to know how to translate those Latin terms of the faith into the native language to preach, for example. So that's the reason that we have mostly religious literature. There is some secular literature in Old High German, but it's very, very few and far. What changes by the time you get to the Middle High German period are literally hundreds of factors, but some of the important factors that change are greater literacy outside of monasteries. Okay? Where do you think the literate people other than the monks came from? Who? Sorry? Nobility, right? So courts, kings and princes, etc., would have a better educated populace at their court. And it's those court poets who wrote most of the literature in Middle High German. Another factor that changes along with that is the development Europe-wide, not just in the German-speaking lands, of other forms. For example, the love lyric, right? Like the troubadour poetry that moves to Germany. So it's imitating other forms that are getting popular in other places. Other factors include greater access to narratives, to stories, to actual texts even from other kingdoms, from other parts of Europe, right? What are some of the most popular secular stories you can think of from the Middle Ages? Most of them have, or not most, a lot of them have to do with a certain king and his knights. Yeah. Right. Arthurian legends, for example, are not just in Germany or not just in France. It's a European phenomenon. So as people are circulating these texts around, you get a much, much greater number of texts and types of texts. Yeah. Yes?
When did the courtly love, I guess fad, I guess you can call it, get into?
That's a good word.
Get
It was a
into-
fad. It was very, very popular. Yeah.
Yes, when did that, transition into the German speaking?
Essentially, at least from the earliest texts we have, basically late 12th century. Yeah. Which is the very beginning of the classical period of Middle High German literature. Yeah. Which is important if, I don't know how many of you are really gonna go on with German, but if you do, if any of you are majors and minors and you want to learn about German literature, you'll find out that in German literary history, the two most important ages of German literature from a sort of national, sometimes even nationalist perspective, are the classical Middle High German period and Goethe, right? Right? Those are the end points, the highlights of German literature, and have been conceived that way for a long time. So this is something, this period of the love lyric, of the courtly romance, etc., were prized all the way up to the modern age. Yeah.
Well, I have just some questions for Alex. Just to your last question, so around 1160, there's going to be the first love
Yeah,
lyric
sure.
that sold me in King. So I raised a falcon. And interested in, and interesting thing about it is the voice in the poem is a woman, right? And the woman basically raised this falcon who is her knight, more or less. But they ascribe it to der from der Kürtenberg, the one from the Kürtenberg. The Kürtenberg is just right outside of Linz. So, in one way, the first medieval love lyric we had in German may have been from a woman.
Which, I mean, to piggyback onto your comment, I should talk about that too. I mentioned in the Old High German period, we really have texts by men. Right? In the Middle High German period, it gets really tough to figure out what's going on because there are poems written from the perspective of a woman, many of which, through things like comparing the language that they use, we can ascribe to men, or some that we know were written by men. Some men were actually commissioned to write poems from the perspective of a woman in various circumstances. But it is possible that we do have texts in the Middle Ages, or in Middle High German period written by women. Another example is on one of the inside leaves of the manuscript, there's this little short verse, a nice little kind of sappy verse that essentially goes, I am yours, you are mine. What is the rest of that?
Ich bin mein, du bist die.
Ja, du bist mir, ich bin
Ich bin
die.
dein kleines Schlüssel.
Yeah, you have the key to my heart is locked up inside, right? This is the little verse. And that actually, given where the text was found and everything, may have been written by a nun rather than a monk, for example.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I just want to finish off with you can start to kick the bucket. In German, you give up the spoon. Also makes no sense. I'd like to